Bennett Foddy has always taken a rather experimental approach to game design, often resulting in mechanics that are simple but incredibly difficult to master, such as in his climbing and running simulators named GURP and QWOP, the latter after its unusual choice of keyboard commands. And in Getting Over It, with Bennett Foddy, you play as a man in a cauldron, and using only the movement of the mouse or trackpad, you must climb a mountain with a hammer. Simple, but in practice, incredibly difficult.
This thing that we call failure is not the falling down, but the staying down. Mary Pickford.
As you climb, Foddy himself narrates your progress, offering encouragement, discussing game design, and meditating on the very notions of frustration and failure.
The frustration is just essential to the act of climbing, and it's authentic to the process of building a game about climbing.
Getting Over It, it's pretty open about its philosophy. From the philosophical narration by Foddy himself to playing as Diogenes, a Greek philosopher who rejected all conventions of civilization, favouring a return to the simplicity of nature, and reportedly living inside a large pot. You can even find these illustrations of Diogenes in the game, something I noticed from having to replay this section a lot.
Oof, sorry about that.
And there is a lot to take in. The mountain starts out normal enough, but becomes increasingly absurd and overwhelming. A dystopian nightmare of consumer products and man-made construction. Everything Diogenes was trying to escape. It's this environment that really drew me into the game. How it begins to position the game not only as an exercise in frustration and failure, but also as a contemplation on the original and the derivative, on the personal and the universal. Firstly, everything in the game, every boulder and box, every piece of furniture, even the character you play as, is a pre-made asset, found by Foddy and assembled into this mountain of trash. And this is how Foddy describes these objects, as trash.
For years now, people have been predicting that games would soon be made out of prefabricated objects, bought in a store and assembled into a world. And for the most part, that hasn't happened, because the objects in the stores are trash. I don't mean they look bad or that they're badly made, although a lot of them are. I mean they're trash in the way that food becomes trash as soon as you put it in the sink. Things are made to be consumed and used in a certain context, and once the moment is gone, they transform into garbage.
It makes sense then that the first objects we see that are really out of place are a disposable coffee cup and a trash can. And it's not just the items in the game that are pre-made. When not detailing the thought process behind making the game itself, the narration provides quotes on the core theme of failure, from Abraham Lincoln to Jennifer Aniston, which are all, in their own way, another kind of pre-existing asset.
To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche.
And this is doubly true of the various renditions of traditional blues songs used in the game, in that not only are these pre-existing songs, but in several cases these are songs that have been repeated and re-recorded so many times that their actual origin is unknown, such as Poor Boy Long Ways From Home or Going Down the Road Feeling Bad. Even its gameplay is derivative, something Foddy draws attention to near the beginning of the game, explaining how the game is a homage to the 2002 game Sexy Hiking by the enigmatic and now inactive developer Jazuo, which features a similarly unforgiving, if more crudely made, climb up a mountain, again with a hammer, again made entirely out of recycled parts. This introduces two sides of trash culture, in one way condemned as fast, easy, consumable, disposable.
When everything around us is cultural trash, trash becomes the new medium, the lingua franca of the digital age. And you can build culture out of trash, but only trash culture. B games, B movies, B music, B philosophy.
But when discussing B games, Foddy describes something quite different, something much more artistic and authentic.
And B games are rough assemblages of found objects. Designers slap them together very quickly and freely, and they're often too rough and unfriendly to gain much of a following. They're built more for the joy of building them than as polished products.
Certainly the idea of this process being journey rather than goal-oriented rings true in a game centered around appreciating failure and frustration. But I think there's more to Getting Over its emulation of B games than just the parallel experience of pursuing something for its own sake. And it ties into the anti-design trend exhibited throughout Foddy's work. A resistance to, or total disregard for, the orthodoxies of game design. Instead, embracing what is unfamiliar, unfair and unreliable. Fittingly, the anti-design movement originally emerged in art and design history as a criticism of consumer culture, an ideology that's distinctly relevant to Diogenes' struggle. But here it also serves another function.
When people encounter QWOP, they feel like they've discovered something that nobody else has played. Talking about anti-design, I mean, part of it is about giving people a sense of having an experience that is a little wild, that is not curated. But it's the sense of discovery and newness that I love about these sorts of games. Is games that don't care too much about good design.
I think this impression of being uncurated, along with the unfriendliness of anti-design, contributes initially to a sense of isolation, relating this isolation to the feeling of frustration and failure. The trash mountain becomes increasingly absurd. The physics and rules that bind the character and the player to the constant threat of falling seems, with a few exceptions, not to apply to the pile of furniture, boxes and tools that impossibly balance in a tower that appears unending. And as you climb, these gravity-defying positions only become more bizarre and increasingly preposterous, as if taunting you that you, and only you, are subject to the unrelenting force of gravity. This is a feeling that can often come with isolation, like you're climbing, struggling, alone. This feeling is only exacerbated by the gameplay mechanics. If you're stuck, you won't really benefit from watching others play, or watching a walkthrough. These mechanics are much more about feeling than seeing. You have to feel things out for yourself. But this is where Foddy's narration plays a particularly interesting role. That it's not just about explaining the philosophy behind the game, but equally putting the developer into it. Playing with Bennett Foddy makes this a more personal experience. And as the narration becomes increasingly candid and sincere the higher you climb, this experience becomes one that is less about isolation and much more about connection.
You've learned to hike. There's no way left to go but up, and in a moment I'll shut up. But let me say, I'm glad you came.
After all, even the game doesn't exist in isolation, assembled from pre-made assets, modelled from sexy hiking, not to mention the culture that has formed around it, from the games it itself inspired, some more worthwhile than others, to its popularity on streaming and Let's Play channels. And to return to the idea of watching others play, it might not help when you're stuck and you can't really appreciate the game's exploration of frustration and failure if you're watching instead of playing. But the way this game interacted with game streaming and Let's Play culture, however unintentionally, is an interesting addition, because what you do get from watching others play is seeing that same climb from another perspective, and suddenly that climb isn't so isolating. We climb alone, but the experience of climbing is shared. Between developer and player, one player and another, or player and audience. And in a game that is so much more about the journey than the finish line, I think the ways that this journey can take different forms for different players is more uniquely relevant. Whether it's frustration in just trying to reach the summit, or trying to perfect every swing of the hammer. Whether it's fast and erratic, or slow and methodical. And some might never reach the top, giving up or just deciding to stop, concluding their time is better spent elsewhere. And that's a valid ending too. As Foddy has said, one of the things about my games is that they're indifferent to whether you get to the end or not. The sense of being able to play it for a while and just stop. There's nothing incomplete or shameful or failure-oriented about that. Foddy has explained how he didn't think many people would play the game, and even fewer would care to finish it. But he ended up creating something that people really connected with. What started out as a single-player experience became, for many, a communal experience, with sections of the game even earning their own community-sourced names like Devil's Chimney and Orange Hell. And in the end, you find you weren't the only person to reach the summit. This wasn't quite the wild or uncurated encounter these bizarre, unfriendly mechanics first promised. And that's okay. In fact, it maybe even enhances certain themes of the game. Because while this outcome may have been unintentional, I think getting over it was always dealing with this kind of humanization, inserting the developer into the game, directly addressing the player, acknowledging and building on the work of others, rejecting the idea of a game, of culture, as something that is just to be consumed. Maybe the idea behind using Diogenes isn't just a criticism of this trash culture, but is also a symbol of struggling with something for its own sake, not out of necessity, but as a choice. Because there's something peculiarly human about that action too. An impulse that, as it turns out, isn't so uncommon. Because, in the quoting tradition of Getting Over It, because we are human, and our nature is to fly. Stephen Hawking. Hey everyone, thank you for watching. There's actually a reward at the end of the game if you do reach the summit, which I didn't want to spoil and I'm not going to spoil. But for anyone who doesn't know what that is and would like to, I've written a little paragraph about it down in the description. So go read that if you're interested, because the reward very much ties into what this video is about. Thanks again for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time.